We have a really special program tonight. Brookside Museum, as you know, has done multiple programs on a lot of American history, and specifically on the wars of the United States. You know, we've done programs on from the Revolutionary War up through World War II. We've never done a program on Vietnam, so we're fortunate to have that program tonight. And Kat Fitzpatrick will be leading that program, and we'll let Paul introduce her in a second. So I just want to talk again about, as I usually do, about what's coming up next for Brookside. And this is a busy week, so in 4 days from now we have Frederick Douglass himself coming here to do a program about what his beliefs were in American democracy. So it's really timely. We had him scheduled for July, if you remember, July 28th, and he came down with COVID, so it got rescheduled. And we're fortunate to have him because we're kind of piggybacking on a program that he's doing at the National Historic Park, Saratoga Battlefield, aka Saratoga Battlefield, on Saturday. So he will be here Sunday at 2 o'clock. And so we're really honored to have him. He's really well renowned in terms of what programs he's done. He's done interpretations of Frederick Douglass on Washington Mall and other places. So if you have a chance to come, I think there's still some opening slots on that you can find on the website. So that's kind of special for us, and we're fortunate to have it. A couple weeks after that, on October 8th, we're having Ben Kemp, who's the operations manager at Grant's Cottage. Maybe some of you know him. And he is a reenactor, and he also interprets a number of different historical characters. And this time he's going to interpret not Ulysses S. Grant, but William Arkell, who was a person that actually developed Mount McGregor and built the Balmoral Hotel up there, which was just really, the Grant's Cottage was in the shadows of that hotel in 1885 when Grant was here. So he's going to tell you about how that came about as a resort. So, and later in October, on the 25th, we have George Ward, who will be here to do a program on the Erie Canal in Song and Stories, which is really another special event. We're doing it on a Friday night, because it's kind of a Friday night thing to do, you know, to have music and so on. So we hope you would consider coming to some of these events. We're trying to expand the diversity of what we offer in Brookside Museum. And I think this fall we've got a number of programs like that. Now, one thing I'd be remiss if I didn't mention membership. If you are a member, thank you. If you've renewed your membership for the year, thank you again. But we have membership levels from $25 for senior to $5,000 for lifetime membership. Memberships are the wellspring of any museum, especially a small historical museum like us. And we've been fortunate over the last 4 years to quadruple our membership from about 100 people to almost 400 people. And it's people like you that we count on to keep this museum going. So if you get an opportunity to renew your membership or join, you can do that on brookesidemuseum.org. Okay, I've done all my advertisements. I'm going to introduce the person who's going to introduce. Paul Perot is a longtime educator. Most of you may know him. First in Shenandoah, but then long-term in Boston Spa School District, and raising to the level of the principal at the high school. Until he retired. He's retired like 3 times in his career.
I'm getting good at it.
The last 12 years, thereabouts. 14, who's counting. He's been the Malta town historian, and he's retired from that. But he's not retired from a lot of activities in historical work, and he's done a lot of work for and with Brookside on a volunteer basis before he retired and since. So we're honored to have him here, and he's going to tell you a little more about Catherine Stewart. So,
Did you want to use the microphone?
can you hear me?
I can hear you very well, yeah. Okay, okay. Good evening. We're all here tonight because we have an interest in the human condition throughout history. Usually, we're learning about our stories from third or fourth hand renditions about people's lives in some far off time frame or far off land. Tonight, we're going to hear a first-hand account of events that we may be either vaguely or intimately familiar with, depending on where you were in 1975. Kat has lived in a variety of places around the world. She's lived in Korea, Taiwan, Hawaii, Idaho. But two other places that bring her to us tonight are Saigon, Vietnam, and Round Lake, New York, where she lived a number of years. She now lives in Delmar, I believe, but she first became familiar with our community when she lived in Round Lake, and we first became familiar with her there. Kat's book, For the Love of Vietnam, A War, a Family, a CIA Official, and the Best Evacuation Story You've Never Heard, is naturally dedicated to her family, who experienced it along with her. But it's also dedicated to, quote, all those affected by the Vietnam War. In other words, all of us. Looking over tonight's audience, and I don't want to insult you, but looking over your audience, it's my guess that most of you carry some memories, perhaps some scars, either physical or psychological, from that time period. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Kat Fitzpatrick, who is a wonderful storyteller with an exciting tale to share. Kat?
Thank you so much, Paul. He did something that I was going to warn you about, which has brought me to tears a little bit. I'm honored to be here. I look at this audience and think you guys probably know more about Vietnam than I do in a lot of ways. I'm sure you all have things in your minds and your hearts and might be wondering how someone of my ilk could be talking about it. So I come to you very humbly. And I also want to warn you that I seem to cry every time I talk about this subject. And I have been studying this since 2012. I actually had a conversation with a friend. I don't know why I was inspired to bring the notebook. And I just had such an upwelling of emotion. I can't even really describe it. It wasn't fear or anger or sadness. I said I was transitioning jobs, and she goes, well, I think you should take some time and write about Vietnam. And I just bowled over, and she goes, if it's too painful, you don't have to. And I said, no, I'm not sad, I'm not angry, I don't know what that was. But that day I went out and bought this notebook and began to write. It's August 12th, 2012. I was between jobs. Didn't have a place to live. I didn't have a job, but I felt like I had this call. And I wrote, but to write about Vietnam seems a hubris for someone like me. I was 8 years old. And still, after all this time and all the studying I've done, and I've tried to study as thoroughly as I can so that I'm at least knowledgeable, I'm not a historian, but that I know the depths of what the story is about, I still cry sometimes. So if I do tear up or choke up, don't worry, it's just normal. I breathe through it and we move on. It's not so much sentimentality, it's just such a deep subject. And, but I want to start this unique story about Vietnam with something that this Berkside and the Saratoga County Historical Society inspired in me, which was, I was like, this is all about local history. And I was like, holy cow, in all my studies, I never went to see my grandparents' gravestone in Middletown. So my dad was a New Yorker, grew up in Middletown, was there for 18 years. And so this was just this year. It was quite fantastic. I felt very historical, very much of a researcher, and went and, make sure I'm pointing this right, went to see where my grandparents were resting. And I thought, where does history begin, actually? Like, where does my history begin? Where does all history begin? So kind of a profound question, but I thought it was worth just going over a little bit. My grandmother was a Phelps, and she's connected with the Phelps family in the Adirondacks. There's the Phelps Town, Phelps Mountain, Phelps Island, and my dad worked for the Ontario Western Railroad. My grandfather is my dad when he was little. And somehow, after living here for over a decade, I was like, gosh, I really just love New York, and couldn't figure it out. I know it's a slogan, but, and I came to realize, well, my dad spent 18 years of his life here, and so this is why maybe I feel this roots. So there's a very interesting thing about our connection to places and history. And for some reason, this is my dad, not too long before he died in 1992. For some reason, I was taken to Vietnam at the age of 8, which gave me a connection to the place. Somehow I took up journalism in college, and then somehow I was inspired, led to write about this subject. So I've taken it up with my whole heart, somewhat grudgingly though, again, over the past 10 years. So I didn't come to this like, oh boy, it's a subject I really want to write about. This is something I really want to do. Some people, you'll make $1 million writing a book about it. I've always been like, this is a calling, maybe a mission. So I'm doing it really out of service. And I have actually no real personal goals for this except to show up where I'm called to show up. I've worked at LL Bean and been at the counter, and somebody comes up and he's a veteran, and we end up talking about it. And we have this amazing conversation in like 3 minutes that changed both of us. I don't know why or how that happens, but I've been noticing it happens. And it kind of all started here. This is my dad and I when I was just 8. It's Vung Tau, which is a beach resort in Vietnam. All the soldiers used to go there on R&R. We lived apart from him for 2 years, maybe because Saigon wasn't safe, wasn't the best place for families. But in 1974, it was deemed safe for families. So he wrote to us, and this is a copy of his letter. I think you'll like it here. It should be a great adventure for our whole family. So in the States, people were getting different information than we were getting overseas. There wasn't the internet. You didn't have a lot of information coming at you. So we thought it was going to be great to be in Vietnam. But I just want to take a moment to speak about the veterans, because as I started to look at this subject, I thought, how can I, again, a hubris, how can I write about this when so many people were so hurt? So in 2014, I got a chance to go to DC just overnight, and I said, I gotta go to the wall, and I just felt like I had to do something to make a gesture. And as I was walking down, I saw this gentleman, I got his name after John Granfors, and I saw him looking up, and it was so touching. And of course, how many people have stood there in the same way? But as I was looking at my photo, I had an old-fashioned camera. He left, and I went running after him, and I caught up to him, and I said, could I have your permission to use this photo? Because this is where I cry all the time. I said, I want to write about this, but I just don't know why or how I can. And he took my hand, and he said, people can't forget. And I said, that's why I think I should write about it. And he said, then I said, I'll do my best for you, sir. So this was just a really nice coincidence or happenstance. And I went to look him up a couple of years ago. I had his email, but he didn't answer. And on Facebook, both he and his wife, who's right behind him, had this photo as their Facebook photo. So it obviously meant a lot to him too. His buddy was supposed to come home 3 days. He had 3 more days in country at that point. So I want to And when he shook my hand, I really felt like he was giving me permission. It was like a benediction that I could go ahead and write about this and talk about it. So, oops, there's a slide missing. Oh, no, I was thinking back to, it'll be a great adventure for our whole family when you get here. So where was here? Interestingly enough, it was South Vietnam. And why were we there? I always go over this, like, why was the United States there? You guys probably all know this. Some audiences I talk to don't really understand or get it, but we were there pretty much out of fear. My dad said he was fighting the ghost of Stalin. If we didn't fight, and my mom wrote in one letter home, just like you said, Mom, if we don't fight the commies over here, we're going to be fighting them at home on our shores. And of course, there was the domino theory that if we lose in Vietnam, it's going to cover the rest of the earth. So the United States was there out of fear to protect the homeland, and kind of for good reason, because Stalin and Mao Zedong had killed like 60 million of their own people in their own countries. Not their enemies, it was their own people that they killed. So there was, it wasn't unusual to be fearful of something like that. But Ho Chi Minh, who was in charge of the North Vietnamese, Viet Minh, and then later Viet Cong, he actually, this is his Declaration of Independence, he actually quoted the United States independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice. And he appealed to Truman and said, would you help us get our country back? Just like the colonies in America wanted to have their own country, we would like to have Vietnam back. They'd been occupied by the Chinese, the French, the Japanese. They're like, could we just get our own country back, just like the United States had done? But because he had been studying communism, it seemed like he was allied with the Soviets and with China. It was very different his approach to government, but it was too close, and we were also allies with the French from World War II. So all these things are what like made us be there as a country. But the question is, like, why was my father there? This is him. I still have this little box too. This is a Colonel Chan was welcoming them in 1972. My dad worked it's always funny to say because it sounds so deathly. He was in psychological warfare, which really, if you go to psywarrior.com, it's like, capture their minds and their hearts capture their hearts and their minds capture their hearts and their minds and their bodies will follow. Something along those lines. That doesn't sound quite right. But the idea, what he was working on was actually radio broadcasts. Psychological warfare goes all the way back to throwing leaflets out and having trucks driving through the city and loudspeakers going, but it had gotten up to being where it was actually radio. He worked in Korea broadcasting into China in the early 70s. Nixon went to China in 72. So I sometimes think, I wonder if, and my dad had some connection with Kissinger. So I often wonder if he was in that effort to get Nixon to China and break down those tensions between the two countries. But so when he was sent to Vietnam after China, the tensions eased, he worked at a radio station at this warehouse at number 7 Hong Tap 2 Street, which became known as House 7. His co-worker is actually a subordinate. Wrote this little book called Get Out Any Way You Can that tells a good part of the story. Is a great resource for me. So there he went. He was moved to this nondescript building that my mom wrote home once. Oh, the bombing that you heard about wouldn't have happened it wasn't the radio station that Jim, my dad, works at, because there's hardly any guards there because it's supposed to be so secret. I'm like, that doesn't sound very safe. There's hardly any guards there. But it was, when you get down to it, and again, I said psychological warfare, it was a very warm-spirited community. They actually sang the songs, they wrote and sang the songs inside the studio. And they worked together to find out what was the best message that they could send into North Vietnam, hoping to get any soldiers that were still fighting to lay down their arms and come home to Mother Vietnam, to South Vietnam. Now, if you remember, there was actually, supposedly the country was at peace. The Paris Peace Accords in 1973 ended the war. But they really only ended the war for the South because the North still had pockets of Viet Cong and Army units in the South. So they were already preparing to come and take over from 1973 through 1974 when we moved there. Still, they were really trying really hard to win the peace, win the war. My dad rode home once after an event. He's like, but you know me, after I congratulated Wen Zong, I felt so happy and proud that tears were welling up, and I took off. They just wouldn't understand. There's so much that goes into each one of these little improvements that you have your heart and soul in each one and probably overreact when it comes off. So my dad was really emotionally invested in this effort, this Mother Vietnam at House 7, with all these South Vietnamese who were working so hard to secure the South, even though, again, supposedly the war was over, as far as Nixon and Kissinger were concerned. And this was kind of his tone, that you really have your heart and soul in the whole thing. So the question was, this is a picture of my whole family. Why were we there? We were quite the group. My mom, 7 kids. This is Chris, Jimmy, Kim, who we adopted when we lived in Korea, Mike, myself, my sister Michelle, and John. Just to back up a little, again, I was born in Virginia. My dad got transferred to Korea in 1970, so we were there for 2 years. And then he got transferred to Vietnam. But because it wasn't safe at the time, the family, went to Taiwan. So just like a lot of military families, I guess, you're separated from your loved ones. But we were in Taiwan for 2 years while my dad was in Vietnam and came back every 5 or 6 weeks. So that was tough on my mom, having to have 7 kids on her own. And tough. I wrote to my dad a lot. I missed him a lot. So we were really happy to be there. So that's why the family was there. And then we were also there because of politics. The family moved because Graham Martin, who was the ambassador at the time, I used to really hate this guy. But now I just feel sorry for him because as I researched more, he was really put into Saigon. He got there about the same time my dad is, in 1972, because Kissinger really felt like he was going to do what he wanted and just stick with it, even though it was a hopeless situation. Kissinger and Nixon, at least from my research, and there's a lot out there, but kind of knew it really wasn't going to work. This peace talk wasn't going to work. But it gave us a decent interval. And I mean, thank God, we got out, the soldiers got out, but we really left things in shambles. It wasn't as if we really did a good job there and then came home. So Graham Martin is the one that said, hey, it's safe in 1974. Why don't you guys, families, just come on in? And the school I went to, there was about 250 students in it, so 250 American dependents there at the time. And then we were there too because my mom and dad really loved each other and were missing each other a lot. In fact, they got married in 1958 in Germany. It was one of my dad's first CIA posts. And they wrote home that they were the luckiest people in the world to have found each other. I'll come back to something about that time, August 2nd. So Saigon, when we got there, so here I am, 8 years old, pretty much just looking for a normal life. But right 1 month after we got there, Nixon resigns. My mom writes home, and my mom is a hero in all of this too, which is because she wrote so many letters, told so many little vignettes and stories in her letters that it actually really informs everything I do. Without it, I wouldn't have the depth of things to share. So she wrote, looks as though Nixon has had it. I'm so sick of it all. And even if he's wrong, it still makes one want to weep. So it wasn't, I don't think it was apparent to them right then what that was going to mean, but it did feel very divisive and really difficult at that time. This is me in the 3rd grade. That's me right in the very front, looking suspicious of the photographer. I was really nervous going to school. I remember getting taken to school, and then I thought it was supposed to be out at noon, and it wasn't out till 12:30, and I was just on edge. And it's not that big of a deal for a child to be afraid like that. But as I look back, I think I was very uneasy about what was going on. We had suddenly had this big 3-story house, and with an armed guard in the front. And then we weren't really supposed to walk around. And we had a tiny alley we could ride our bikes around in circles. But in Taiwan, we'd had the whole run of the neighborhood. We had a 2-acre yard. And suddenly in Saigon, we found ourselves in a completely different situation. And I was 8 years old. I'm like, I'm not even sure. I mean, I would never take an 8-year-old into such a situation now. So how my psyche and really came to terms with that. My dad wrote home in August, the peace and the ceasefire in Vietnam are curious. Da Nang, which is very far north, is almost to the DMZ line, is hit with 5 dead yesterday, and the general level of fighting kicked off by the North Vietnamese is rising daily. People back home may be thinking of Watergate and Nixon, inflation and gas prices, but the war is very close and very real to us here. So this is just after we got there. And of course, we had just moved there, so what were we going to do? Just try to ride it out. Maybe it will get better. We did things like go to the zoo. So it's like a very normal childhood. My mom wrote it. I took the kids to the zoo and a couple of others not long ago. It was such a pleasant surprise. It was the animals were clean, and it was a very well-run place. But you can see I wasn't thrilled about the zoo either. She wrote home in September, we aren't supposed to walk on the streets. We have to avoid any large crowd. And people do periodically burn themselves up. And I did research. I couldn't find anyone in 1974, at least nothing reported of any monks burning themselves on the street, but she was obviously still scarred by the period in 1963 when there was quite a lot of self-immolations. Thich Quang Duc, this was one of the first and biggest ones. And JFK said, no news picture in history has ever generated so much emotion around the world as this one. And it's said to have lit the match that got people to think about Vietnam. But it really made me realize that my mom was thinking about how what kind of lengths people were going to express what they were thinking and feeling. Then it took me quite a long time to realize that I was like, oh, well, he was protesting the war, just like so many American people at home or around the world. He wasn't protesting the Americans being in Vietnam. He was protesting the Thieu government, who we were supporting. Well, actually, sorry, at that time it was the Diem government, but the same governments that we were supporting because they were treating the Buddhist community so poorly. How poorly would it have to be for somebody to put themselves to death through fire. So it was a hard comeuppance when I realized that the U.S. had been supporting governments that were so bad to their people that this was the kind of demonstrations that were taking place. But again, back to normal life as a child, we went on a Saigon river trip, a very wonderful, relaxing day. And that's me right at the front of the boat. And it doesn't show there that I looked around and I was standing next to my brother Chris, who's 5 years older than me, and he's like, there could be Viet Cong out there anywhere. And I was like, what's a Viet Cong? And he didn't really explain to me, but I got the idea that it had to do something with somebody with a gun. So again, this very strange juxtaposition of being a child and being in a situation like that. My mom wrote home once that she wanted to go, or my dad said, should we go sightseeing in Bien Hoa? And Mom said, is it Get Americans Day? That you couldn't go everywhere because at certain times, because that was their day. They were going to attack Americans, the Viet Cong, or any of their North Vietnamese soldiers. And she was trying to get a handle on things, but it's like, it seems to be a city of rumors. One does not know what to believe. On October 31st, we were in school. The phone calls started going back and forth, and our driver, all the kids' drivers came in and took us out. We could barely get through the streets. And again, these were demonstrations against the Thieu government that the Americans were supporting, our government was supporting. So on this day, we had lockdown in our house, had to stay in there. We had to do Halloween at home, which was devastating. But my mom and dad did the best they could. We had some little rooms we went in and some scary things. But I was thinking, do we need something scary at home after being scared all morning, being evacuated out of school? In December, we got away for a Christmas treat, and my mom wrote home, well, if things are too bad, we'll just leave from Thailand. But we didn't, but when we got back, there had been quite a bit of activity. Phuoc Long had fallen, which was a big main province. Once that went, there was, the feeling was like, oh, talk about a domino effect. The North Vietnamese are far enough into the south with divisions that we're not gonna be able to make it. So it started looking really, really bad. And my mom wrote home in the beginning of February. Jim asked my Lon, who's a radio star, who is the voice of Mother Vietnam, what will happen if the commies take over? My father will shoot us and then commit suicide. Remember back to where my dad was like, you have your heart and soul in this whole thing, and he's just really loving what these people are doing. They believe in what they're doing. They believe that maybe they'll be able to stop the North Vietnamese from invading, but it's not looking that way. And the fate that these people will, before the commies can get to them, is they'll take their own lives. So, and this is Mylon. She was American, educated, and really, she was the one that kind of kept House 7 together. So she was a figure, leader, had worked closely with my dad. But this cracks me up. My mom, maybe she bought it before, but my brother's birthday was in the middle of March, and she gave him a bowling ball. So it was a 10-pound bowling ball. I was like, wow, this is so cool. But to think that you would give that to somebody as a gift when you're contemplating maybe having to evacuate out of the country, it just is like the perfect thing, I think, shows that, how you're trying to work in these two completely different ways. You're trying to act like it's normal life. You have to keep the family going. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese army is bearing down on you. So on March 30th, 3 days before we were supposed to fly out, the North Vietnamese captured Da Nang, sweeping the vast Air Force bases where the U.S. forces had first been greeted with flowers in 1965. 1965, so it was almost exactly 10 years later. And as we all know, it's just like 10 years of really pain and suffering of, you know, mystery, like what was all that time and blood for? I don't know how many of you saw pictures of Da Nang. That was when there were Vietnamese taking children and trying to get them onto ships that were going out. People were hanging off of planes that were taking off, so desperate to get away from the communists. The news, of course, got into Saigon. My father heard that news and was like, I am not going to let this happen to my people. The people that he was taking care of. He even wrote home, you know, I might get shot by the bureaucracy, but I'm getting my people out of here. So he knew it might cost his job, if not his life. We took off on Pan Am, and he one of those letters he wrote to my mom before they crossed in the mail was, oh, I just imagined you getting on the plane and having a martini and calming down. My poor mom, I'm just going to read through this because it's just so absurd. The trip that we had, and there was the 8 of us. First, we departed to Manila, to Guam, then left Guam. The engine went out. They jettisoned the fuel and then circled back to Guam. They wet down the plane, but then, so we had to sit on the plane for like 4 hours while it dried off. To the hotel, we slept over, stayed overnight again, departed for Hawaii on the same plane. The engine was out. Had to go back, went to Hawaii, slept an hour and a half, and then to San Francisco, and then finally arrived at her parents' place in Idaho. So she wrote in her diary, she's like, weary. Oh my goodness. Does everybody, do you remember the baby lift? Anybody remember the baby lift flight? So we were supposed to actually be on this flight on April 4th. Gerald Ford had started and working with getting as many babies out, as many orphans, many of them babies of soldiers there. So they were not going to be well treated if they were left behind. And my mom was, in addition to 7 kids, somehow she found time to volunteer at orphanages and really wanted to help as much as she could. She looked forward and thought, well, if I take 8 of my kids on a flight that's supposed to get orphans out, that's going to take up too much space. So she deferred, got another flight out. But it wasn't until I was like about 10 years ago that I realized all my life I had this survivor guilt that I was alive because I wasn't on that plane. I was alive because orphans had died. Almost half the orphans and half the crew members died on that plane. And it hit Saigon it was just so deflating. My dad just wrote home, one tragedy follows another. And the baby lift flight, he's like, I cry. There's just, another author wrote that it felt like Saigon, it was just like all the air went out of it. Everything that they'd been trying to do, this was like the perfect, the perfect terrible thing. And at first people thought it was some kind of sabotage. Maybe the Viet Cong had planted a bomb. But it turned out that somebody was in a rush and hadn't closed one little strap, and the whole thing decompressed and brought the plane down. So people were under a great deal of stress, and if you do one thing wrong, it can have terrible ramifications. So it was just a terrible, terrible time. So this is the letter where he wrote home actually to my mom saying that talk is of getting 1 million people out. I don't believe it. They may try and then cry and say we are sorry. I'm not operating that way. I may fail, but I intend to do what is necessary before the crunch comes and succeed. There are many details I can't write here for obvious reasons. If I make it, it will be an odyssey worth writing a book about. And if I don't make it, it still will. Well, luckily, he did make it. He never did write very much. More is a pity. But for many reasons, he and my mom Didn't talk about Vietnam much, as you all know. There wasn't a lot of welcome for the conversations. And so I ended up writing the book. I hope my dad is proud. And I hope I've done justice to it. This is the part in my book. I'm just going to hold it up just for prop's sake. But the first section is all just about my dad and his history and his training. And then the second part, I combine the stories of my childhood, family stories, with the history of the time to try to give some context. So there's some lighthearted, funny stories, and then some historical context. The third part, my cousin is a great fan of all of this, and she's like, but I wanted to be there. Like, how was it for your dad to, the whole evacuation? I said, Laurel, I wasn't actually on the evacuation, so I can't really give you that firsthand account. But from what his co-worker wrote, and from I talked to the Vietnamese people that were there, a few different ones, and did other research. And so I was able to come to bring all this together, synthesize, and make what is called the creative nonfiction or narrative nonfiction that I believe is a worthy sequence of the events. So when we were gone, my dad said, we've got to get out of here. And he was getting things ready, literally things like trash bags and rice and nurse supply, medical supplies, all those kind of things, putting them into storage in the House 7 where he was. And he wrote about how people were just having meetings. He wasn't going to do that. He was actually taking action, doing one thing after another, one small thing after another to make things work. So, like 20 gallons of Nuke Mom. It's so funny, that fish sauce that we Americans really don't like the smell of and the Vietnamese love so much. But he did all the hard work. He got some intel to find that, so Saigon is over here in the river delta, that he could get down here in this little island, Phu Quoc Island, where they couldn't leave, but he's in psychological warfare, right? Making up stories that are gonna be shared, like convincing people. So he came up with a story that, hey, if we move our radio broadcasts out of, this is a new map, but it's Saigon, to a safer spot, we can keep broadcasting, we can keep doing our work and be out of the fray. So they got permission to go down to Phu Quoc Island, and they started taking people on CA-5 airplanes to this spot, landing here, and then coming down here is where, I'll show you in a moment. So this wasn't really an easy feat. The airport was busy, a lot of things were happening. Civilians were trying to get out, but the government said, nobody's leaving, we're just locking it down. Everybody got out kind of by hook or by crook, like, oh, we have to go home and take care of our parents, that kind of thing. But my dad went down and did a reconnoitering. This is his actual calendar he was working with. Found a military base, an abandoned military base with 10 buildings, that two are smaller and 2 small ones. So they started flying on the 21st. And at the time, of course, they didn't know that things were going to end. They just started on the 21st to get down there. In 2015, I went to visit all these spots. This was part of my research. And this was the beach where they would be in those buildings, and they would go down to the beach to take a bath, wash their dishes and take a bath. It was so beautiful. And now, of course, they're building a hotel on it. But it was not really an easy life. They didn't know how long they were going to be there. So 1,000 people over a period of days traveling by plane. Some of them had never been on a plane before and thought they were leaving, which they were, everything that they knew and loved. This was just me as an adult and on that beach. as they were there, they knew they built a kind of a camp in that place. They had they had a water buffalo trucks with water. They had food that my dad had brought. They could go into the town. This is the town Antoy, so they would be traveling from here to here. They had to be really careful. My dad actually had to have daily meetings. I have his agendas of like, don't tell people where you are, where you're from. Don't let anybody else in the camp. It got to be very like keeping themselves secret, because even though they were surrounded by other South Vietnamese, people were starting to get the idea, oh, these people from Saigon are going to get out of the country and they're going to leave us here for when the North Vietnamese come. So this was one of the beaches down here. Where they were reconnoitering to find their way out. When I looked at this, I was like, that doesn't look like a beach you could really get off of. So I found this is not an actual photo of the beach they were on, but these were the kind of ships that had been lined up. And there's a freighter, similar freighter to what they would have to get out on. So they're down there, my father and these 1,000 people and the rest of his staff. While in Saigon, people are just going crazy. Like, people want to leave. Ambassador Martin is saying, it's safe here, we need to stay. And there's a huge amount of disinformation, non-information, no communication. Nobody had arranged for a ship for my father and his 1,000 people. They had to get out there and start talking to people on their own. And it was only sort of actually really like luck almost that they found an American ship that would agree to take them off the beach. This is at the American Challenger. And so, again, the country is starting to fall. They know that if they fall into the hands of the North Vietnamese, people are either going to want to take their own lives, or they're afraid they're going to get taken or put in similar concentration camps, re-education camps. So they find a ship that's willing to take them, but it wants Saigon to say, okay, you can do that. So that comes the fall, the 30th of April, with still no permission. But what are they going to do? The CIA station in Saigon writes out a telex. It's been a long fight and we have lost. Saigon signing off. So they get that. Down in Phu Quoc Island, a telex comes through. It is over. Like, Saigon is just shutting down. And this was, of course, in Washington. They wouldn't have seen that yet. They're on the island and they radio into Saigon and get almost no answer. And then finally, and that's where his coworker got the name of his book. Finally, the guy on the other line says, "There's nothing we can do for you. Just get out any way you can." And they're left there. And I can't even imagine what my father was feeling with 1,000 people on his, looking to him. Fortunately, the Captain Butcher from the American Challenger decided, well, I guess nobody's in charge. I'll go ahead and take you. But still, and this is, I'll just do a little segue. In 2005, my brother Chris, after Vietnam, my dad retired and we went to Hawaii, a combination of the East and West. My mom just couldn't stand to be in the suburbs anymore. It's a very strange coincidence. My brother goes to a party actually right next door, ends up talking to somebody. Her name is An. Turns out that her dad was in Vietnam, or they were Vietnamese. And then as he keeps talking, he finds out that her dad is Phien, who was one of my father's close coworkers. He was one of the writers at House 7. And so he wrote Chris this letter in 2005. And when I read it, this was 7 years before I started to write, I was like, both of us were just floored, because it gave us the clarity that this stuff had actually really happened. Before then, it was just sort of kind of myths that weren't really spoken aloud. But he wrote to us, "One thing I'll never forget was the moment of pandemonium of the Fall of Saigon in the radio room at Phu Quoc Island, when we received the ultimate message from the U.S. Embassy, 'Go and good luck.' And your father held my hand." There I go again. And he said, "Let's go, Fien." And then he quietly smiled and said, "And I hope luck is with us." So I thought that we got this letter, and Fien died not too long after that, it just really brought home that my dad was right there. He was present. He kind of saw all the dangers. And the Vietnamese, there's another letter, they often hold hands. The men will hold hands with each other. My dad talked about how uncomfortable he was with that. "I thought I would never get my hand back," he wrote in one. But here, he held Fien's hand. He said, "Let's hope that luck is with us." This is a picture, actually it's from another time. It's from that little thing called the Tet Offensive. But it shows the South Vietnamese army. These young men were working really diligently to defend their country. And at this point, Saigon, the country is falling, and the Americans are leaving. They're being left in the worst possible situation in the path of the incoming army. So I'm going to read to you just a little section. When my father was trying to get out, I couldn't understand for the longest time, because I had heard the snippet, the story about him being trapped overnight, about him fearing he was going to get shot, that he could hear M16s clicking all around him. I couldn't understand, like, who was threatening him. And it took a long time trying to come to terms with this, is that it was the South Vietnamese army. Those soldiers were fearful for their lives. And they did not want to be abandoned. And so they had a little reason to be blocking what they saw was abandonment. So this short chapter is called Near Death. They were just about there, just about safe. Also, and at the time, everything was dark. They could just see some lights. But just as James E. Welch, CIA operative, was about to breathe a sigh of relief that he and those under his care had made it to safety, an armed soldier approached from the naval checkpoint and shot out rapid-fire orders in words Welch could not understand. His translator stepped forward. The message he relayed to Welch was earth-shattering. Apparently, no orders had been received allowing them to leave the beach. No matter what, Welch's operations assistant had just left with his own group of 600, and they were now on their way to safety. He and his group of 400 were suddenly sitting ducks, trapped ashore, easy targets for any soldier or wayward soul that wanted to strike out in spite. With the military situation of South Vietnam falling to pieces faster than anyone had ever expected, it was quickly becoming every man for himself. But there was still a possibility of escape. There had to be. "Tell them we do have permission," Welch said in low tones. "Above all, nothing must set the soldiers off." Nevertheless, the angry guard and his translator exchanged several heated sentences. Both were members of the South Vietnamese army, but his translator was poised to exit the doomed country, while the other was on the verge of being abandoned by the Americans who had promised over a decade before to protect the world from the evils of communism. Now they were just running. What right did they have to live? What could possibly keep a forsaken soldier from killing them now? Inexplicably, the head guard chose to put off the moment of fate. He motioned to a subordinate, sending him in search of news from the commanding officer. Sweat dripped down Welch's back as they waited. He could feel his group's gaze upon him, the weight of their lives on his shoulders. The young man returned all too soon, his face a mask of anger. No one could find the commander in charge. Rumor had it that he had left the jetty in a motorboat, fleeing with his family just after the first group departed. When the translator said this, Welch's heart dropped. The delicate threads of control were quickly fraying. Without the usual rules of order in place, the situation was in danger of spiraling out of control. Should that happen, it was quite possible that they could all be slaughtered where they stood. They were so close to escape and yet worlds away. Before Welch could form a reply, another truck pulled up and a dozen more stone-faced South Vietnamese soldiers poured out of the covered bed and ran toward them. The head guard barked out a command, and the troops fell quickly into formation in front of the two getaway boats. Welch eyed the M16s clutched in the hands of the uniformed men. He had never seen anything look so dangerous. Their muzzles were lowered toward his people. All those House 7 employees he had promised to get out. The tiniest wrong move would end in disaster, and there was no help in sight. So that was where they were at that moment. So they did get out. They did get to the ship. Finally, things just resolved themselves at the break of dawn. My dad sent a telegram to my mom on the 2nd. I'm aboard American Challenger with all my people, doing okay. This was the 2nd. Can you imagine? My mother knew that Saigon had fallen. And I guess maybe back then we weren't quite so rushed for news, but it would have been 3 days then since she had heard from him and knew that he was safe. This is a picture of Fien, the gentleman that my dad had held the hand and said, we'll take, hope luck is with us. He wrote also at the end of this, instead of flying out of Vietnam, your father had chosen the risk to stick with his collaborators until all of them were safe in the American rescue boats. Now hundreds of them and their families can breathe the air of freedom in America, and all of them still keep in their hearts the image and memory of their late great boss named Jim Welch. I was trying not to go into it's not, over the years I've realized my dad, he wasn't a hawk, but he was for the war. He was, he sometimes said some things about protesters that I felt were derogatory in retrospect. But, so it's turned into not so much like a hero worship, even though I loved him so much and we were very close, but I really see him clearly in a lot of ways, I think. But these are just some of the people that he saved. She won't let me tell you her name. She said, I cannot disclose things. She worked for the Military Assistance Command, so even to this day, she does not want anything disclosed. But when I met her, this was 40 years after she knew me as a child. We talked for 4 hours straight, as if she was like a family member. Van Vu, Mother Mylon, who was the voice of Mother Vietnam, she had a very similar voice, so they worked together. And she and I also had an instant bond. And House 7 did reunions they're still doing them, although there's a lot less people now. But I got to go and speak with them and share a little bit of my story. And Dustin Wen, who is just on Warriors, I don't know, he was just 2 years older than me, and his mom carried him onto the ship. So he's become a very successful actor. So when I went to the reunion, I was just impressed at all these South Vietnamese people and how well they've done. They're just all very vibrant. I talked to a lot of their families, very successful. They lost everything. They were allowed to take one bag, which actually got lost it was on the beach. It was supposed to be transported to the ships, and it was actually attacked by other refugees and soldiers. It was chopped up and burned. So they lost everything, and then they came here and have very successful lives. And I mean, I can't speak for every single one of them, but the ones that I met, they seemed like they were doing really well. Some of them became doctors. And this is one final reminder that my dad got. This is a picture of the plaque that was given to him. I actually brought it out there right after we got back. One of his co-workers wrote it, sent it to him to commemorate what he had done. I love their wording. It says, within an accelerated timing factor, you helped activate a motivational implementation program through a coordinated approach on an orchestrated basis with all deliberate speed. So we had this hanging in our house, and so this gentleman who made that plaque, it was just right after. And I have a book out there that has some of the letters that the Vietnamese wrote thanking and also asking for more help with getting jobs or finding different resources. But over the years, my dad lived 16 years after Vietnam. And I can't say, I mean, he was just such a good-hearted person. He did a lot of, he didn't do a lot, but he remained a good-hearted person, very good humor and everything. He came down with a terrible throat cancer in 1992 and went to UC Irvine. But by that time, I mean, Vietnam hadn't really faded as it does with somebody who is that connected to it. But when he was at UC Irvine, he was brought into a wheelchair to check in, and the intake doctor looked at his clipboard and looked at my dad, looked at his clipboard again, and said, "Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch?" And then my dad looked up and realized he's Vietnamese, and he said, "Were you on the Challenger?" And the intake doctor said, "Yes, I was. I was on the Challenger." He said, "You saved my family. We've had a picture of you and your family on our mantle the entire year entire growing up of my life." And my dad would look at it and say, "This is Mr. Welch. He is why you're here." This was just a couple months before my dad passed away. And I always felt so grateful for that, because I thought, there he was at the end of his life. He knew the end was coming. And he knew he had done this spectacular feat. But one of the things about history is that, it needs to be told. And in our family, because of all the pain and suffering of Vietnam, and I haven't really gone into too much about how it affected our family, but it wasn't something we sat around the dining room table and told stories about. Somehow, I knew that my dad was in the CIA, and I knew that he had rescued these people. Plaque was on our wall, and sometimes Vietnamese people visit us, but it wasn't something that was storytelling or was celebrated, or that it was really part of the fabric of our life. It was sort of just something on the side. And so I'm grateful to be able to talk about it here. My siblings have told me that they're grateful to hear my stories, and I've cultivated stories from them to integrate. But this story about my dad at the very end, being able to know that he did do something. He did. This gentleman in front of him was a doctor here, safe in the United States because of something he did. And this is my mom and dad. I just wanted to put a picture in there so you could see how they looked when they were happy. But, so why does history matter? It's so interesting. We have this whole museum and a society. And I really think that the reason it matters is because it says we care about each other. Stop crying, Kat. But, when you tell stories, it's a way of connecting, and that's a way of caring. I spend a lot of time pulling stories together, and I told my daughter once, because you end up a lot of time alone at your computer or poring over documents, and I said to her, "I don't even know if this is worth it. Do you think it's worth it?" And she said, "Well, Mom, I think it is. It creates context, gives us context to our lives." So that context comes through storytelling. And again, I didn't take on this project because I thought it would be neat or I wanted to do something great with it. It was like something that was living in me, and I had to answer that. Not everyone needs to do that, and not everyone should. It's kind of not the easiest calling. But I did want to offer, I was thinking about this. I made a few of these postcards. Due to a printing error, I only have about 10. But I thought, if you know of anyone who might have a Vietnam story that they need to talk about, or even amongst us after this, you could send them a postcard like this. I know that Vietnam is part of your story. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here for you. And if you don't want to talk about it, I'm still here. I just want you to know I care. Because like Paul said, Vietnam is affecting everyone right now, whether you know it or not. Like, it's part of the subconscious of our culture. I sometimes talk at schools, and I had a third grader once asked me, but the question is, what was it all for? And I was like, you're in third grade. I don't know if he was parroting someone, but it sounded genuine in his. And I've had an 8th grader saw that I was looking at something, and he was fascinated. I think that the word Vietnam, it immediately invokes emotion in people. So if you have a moment and you notice, and there's one thing you take from this presentation, is that just stop, notice that what's there, and if there's a moment to share, just like I mentioned at the LL Bean counter, just one little conversation can change everything. And you don't know what it's going to be. It's not something you can plan for or prescribe. As I said, when I do these, I'm not coming with a particular goal in mind. I just try to be present and try to bring what might be needed. As it's a tough subject, and if anything, my unique stories, I hope, just opens up the floor a little bit more for just a little bit movement forward with it. I don't know. So I did write For the Love of Vietnam, and I thought a lot about that topic because I know a lot of people are hurt by Vietnam. There's also the sort of the ironic, for the love of Vietnam. But my father was motivated by his love for his work and the staff that he had. And that was his motivation to get it out, get all of them out. And if we're not motivated by love to try to bring together what's been so wrought asunder, then we won't be sustained. Really, the caring and the connection is what sustains us, I think. At least that's what I've found over the years of writing this. I do write weekly on Substack. I do weekly stories of Vietnam. They're all different kinds of stories. Like through all this, I met my librarian from my 3rd grade school, and she's written a book. And so I feature her stories sometimes. I'll write about all sorts of stuff. So if you know somebody who might want to share their story or any aspect of Vietnam, I'd be happy to feature on there if you just want to read some. That's the URL, and I have a card that has it on